I'm not a Catholic, but I feel at home among all of you. I worked in the ecumenical movement for many years as the national coordinator of the 10 Days for World Development program, where I got to know quite a number of you, including Jenny, who just walked in, who was on the board of the 10 Days national program representing development and peace. So our ties go back a long time, and then I was also very involved in the setup of Kairos, being the first executive director there. So I've worked with so many of you, so I'm seeing very familiar faces around here and feel quite at home. I want to thank Anne and the Planning Committee for the invitation to come. I was particularly interested in Anne's first letter, where she was inviting me to consider coming as a resource person, and she said, our aim for the day is twofold: to look at divestment alternatives and to encourage congregations to divest. Then she went on to say, ideally, the focus of your talk will be grounded in theological justice principles, as well as the more practical aspects of how you went about the change. She also said, we want to look at reinvestment options and perhaps alternative options to fossil fuel investments. So I was captured immediately by the clarity of the thinking of this group, and you might say I was hooked right from the start. So I wrote her back, but I said, you know, I would feel much better if you would consider also inviting Walter Whiteley to come along with me from Trinity St. Paul's, because Walter is the one among the 15 or 20 of us who were on our climate justice group and continue on that group, who developed the real expertise in researching alternative investments and researching steps toward divestment. And so I was very thankful not only for their invitation to me, but for their invitation to Walter. So I want to thank Walter for being willing to come along with me. So how we're going to divide this presentation this morning is that I'm going to tell the story of how we did this. And I'm going to do this because it is a story, I think, from which we can all learn a lot. And because we have developed so many of the tools to help us work through this, that we think that'll help you in your divestment. So on the resource table is a list of how you get into the website of Trinity St. Paul's Climate Justice pages to go directly to the things that will help you. So Walter is going then to speak about the divestment and alternative possibilities. I'm going to tell the story, what we learned, why we think it worked, and what we see now as the results of our work. So here we go. We're a downtown congregation located on Bloor Street, 1 block west of Spadina. A number of you may have been in our building for various meetings. We're a small congregation of approximately 200 members, of which we have maybe 80 people worshiping regularly with us on a Sunday morning. But this congregation has a mission, a history of mission-based investments. So this was very important to us right from the beginning, because we're already invested in the Canadian Alternative Investment Cooperative, which a number of you also are, and we're invested in Oiko Credit, which provides financing for small groups of people around the world to get a start in setting up their own little income-generating projects. Within our congregation, we had a background that enabled us to move fairly quickly when we set up kind of climate justice group. In 2009, there had already been a congregational plan that focused on climate justice as one of its 4 mission-based or public witness priorities. Then that was kick-started by an eco-fest we hosted, inviting in the community all around us, including businesses who were doing ecologically sound business things, as well as other NGOs who were involved in environmental and environmentally sustainable work. In 2010, our board accepted a policy that was entitled Commitment to Climate Justice and Environmental Sustainability. And out of that, we did a fair amount of work internally in our church building, trying to see what are the things that we can address immediately around greening this building. But the work kind of floundered after that, and in the middle of the summer of 2013, the board of our congregation was requested by the Public Witness Committee to think of funding, providing a small amount of funds, I think it was $4,000, for us to hire someone, and it was a very particular someone, a theological student, who was at that time hired to work with 3 of the United churches along Bloor Street there, Bathurst Street United that meets in our building, TSP, and Bloor Street United in a youth program that we call Youth on Bloor. Greg Powell had a background in climate change work. He had previously worked with the Pembina Institute, an environmental think tank in Alberta. So the congregation agreed to hire him for 4 hours a week over a period of 9 months. So when you figure out how many hours that is, it's slightly over 3 weeks' work. And his job was really not to lead, but to facilitate the congregation and taking hold of this in a way that would move us in a more urgent way. And it was a critical piece of recognition from our church board. These are pictures from that Eco-Fest where we had activities for all ages. It was a fun time as well as a learning time. So what is our inspiration for divestment work? First of all, we have a creed. In the United Church Creed, there is a statement that calls on us, and we undertake to live with respect in creation. We have a history in our church of also developing all kinds of policy statements and concerns for the vulnerable and the poor, who are the ones who have felt the impact of climate change most significantly. We also, with this congregational priority of climate justice, we knew that we had some backing from the congregation. So then the question became, what do we do? And I will say that part of the inspiration was at the same time the 350.org movement was really taking hold here on the campus of the University of Toronto, and they were hosting the screening of the film Do the Math. How many of you have heard that or seen it? A lot of you. And that was at the Bloor Street Cinema there, the Hot Docs Theater. And so we invited members of our congregation to join us during the season for commitment that fall, and 22 people came with us. And we had a discussion about what we might do. So after we had this discussion on what are we going to do next, we very, very quickly zeroed in and said, we will do this work on divestment. Part of the reason we did that is that we were trying to say, where is work already happening that we can join? So we don't have to start it right from the beginning. Where are other materials and resources that have already been developed that we don't have to do it? And we were very clear that the 350.org movement already was well underway in the US and increasingly becoming present on a number of campuses here in this country. So we said, let's join this group. And they were sending people to sit on our climate justice group right at the beginning. Another thing that became apparent to us is that we didn't want to find ourselves being called to do 5 or 6 different things. So we did agree very early. And this wasn't, it wasn't all planned, it just developed. It just developed. Let's choose one thing and work on one thing. And I can't tell you how important that decision was. because along the way we were called on to do this and that and all kinds of other things, and we would say, nope, that's going to pull us away, that's going to do too much spreading our energies. And so choosing to join the divestment movement meant that we focused ourselves right from the beginning. And because of that focus, we then immediately said, okay, what do we have to do? Well, if we want to get this church, this United Church of Canada, to divest its funds from fossil fuels, then we have to start with ourselves. We have to start with Trinity St. Paul's first, and then we have to figure out a pathway of how we get the United Church to do it. But to get our own church to do it, even though they had it as a priority, we wanted to bring the congregation with us along the way. So we developed a climate primer that is available on our website, and I still read it and think, wow, this was a good tool for us, because we developed it. We started meeting in late August of 2013, and by the end of January, all of this work had been done, and we had a divestment primer. And the primer was handed out to the congregation, and Walter invited the congregation to join us the following week after they had had a chance to read it for a discussion, and 35 people showed up. So we had this discussion where lots of concerns and actions were raised, and they said, we're not going to haggle around about the words. Let's get on with it. Let's do something. And so the very week after that discussion was our AGM, and it was aimed at getting our own funds out of fossil fuels. And it was also aimed at the national church to get their funds out of fossil fuels. Out of that, all kinds of work happened, exploring all these options and conducting financial education sessions in the congregation, because once we made that decision, all kinds of individuals decided they wanted to start doing this too. So how do you talk to your financial manager? And we tried to have sessions to help with that. And then the research of alternative investment opportunities, all of this is going to be addressed in Walter's presentation. So by February 2014, we had two motions. One was to divest our own monies from the 200 top fossil fuel companies in the world, and to get the United Church of Canada General Council to do the same. So these were the two motions. They both passed unanimously. And I'm sorry about the red wording, but I did that for a purpose, because that was the only amendment to the motion that we brought, which was in white, that the Trinity St. Paul's United Church congregation divest of its holdings in the 200 largest fossil fuel companies in order to send a signal to those and other companies and policymakers that we do not want to participate in generating excessive heat-trapping emissions, which are leading the planet to ecological chaos and opposing God's mission of abundant life for all creation. The only amendment that came to that motion came from the chair of our trustee board. And it wasn't an unfriendly amendment. It was a very friendly amendment. It was to say, unless you put in these words, to take active steps to, this might mean that we have to go out tomorrow and divest our funds. And we need to do this in a measured, thorough kind of way. So that got left in there and became part of the key wording that got put into the motion that went forward to the National United Church. So we found out after we did this that we were going to have another motion, because the National United Church has three key pools of funds. They have their treasury funds, they have the United Church Foundation, and then they have a pension fund. And the pension fund is the largest of the three. And because of all of Walter's experience sitting on the pension board at York, and his talking to people in the United Church, we came very rapidly to understand that we couldn't send this motion that the General Council take active steps to divest. We couldn't send that to the pension board because the pension board has a fiduciary responsibility to its plan members, not to the United Church. And Walter will address that more. But our timeline was that we had to go through several levels of governance to even get to the National United Church. And in Catholic circles, you would think diocese, and I don't know whether you go from there to the bishops or what your governance levels are. You avoid the bishops. Yeah, I think I remember that too. Except when I was working in the church, there were some amazing bishops from the Catholic Church who were leading the justice work. So Toronto Southeast Presbytery in January of 2015, the Toronto Conference, which is the next level up of a number of presbyteries, and then eventually by August of 2015 to the National United Church. So if we made our decision in 2014, in February, we had almost a year to start this process, and it took almost a year. And it took almost a year because we had to do different wordings. And the pension board wording was divided into 3 categories. And I'm going to let Walter talk more about that. Walter?
Okay.
But it was basically saying you've got to report to your members and be accountable to your members for how your choices of investment align with our imperatives as Christians and with the documents that we have accepted, and we want to know what your exposure is to fossil fuels, and we want to know what your rationale for keeping them there, given the risk that those assets will be stranded because we can't burn all of the oil that's still in the ground. And so you end up having stranded assets, and the possibility, given the possibility of equal or better returns on divesting these stocks. And I notice that your conversation the rest of the day is going to also help us look at that. So, by the time we got to the end of this process, on the 11th of August 2015, the United Church of Canada voted with a 67% majority to divest from fossil fuels. And this was a great celebration in our camp in particular because we had tried to build a cross-country network to have things coming from different angles from across the church feeding into this motion. And so we also developed a press strategy. So we were out immediately. This wasn't a press release from the National United Church. This was a press release from us working on this. And it got wide, broad coverage across the country in newspapers, and a lot of pushback from certain communities in the United Church in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which we had anticipated, whose livelihoods were often wrapped totally up in the resource extraction. So that's been another thing that the National Church has had to be dealing with, is how pastorally you relate to people who are finding their living off of this industry. And then that was August. By December the 15th, the General Council had already divested its treasury funds. And a lot of the reason they had done that is because we had done the work, doing the research, and finding where to put those funds. And I notice you have someone from Genus here today, Harrison JP. There you are. Where we ended, after all the research, putting our funds. So the United Church Pension Fund has taken limited action, even though that motion at General Council also passed. And they say it's because we're fiduciary to our plan members and not the General Council. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. So why did this work? Well, it worked in our evaluation of this in the fall of 2015. It worked because, first of all, it was faith-centered. You want me to come over? Am I in the way?
You're good.
Okay, so it worked because it was faith-centered, and we did that not only in terms of how we developed our own rationale, but we were participating in the worship life of the congregation with services centered around this. It worked because there was a sense of urgency about it. And our congregation was ready to act. They knew that we had been waiting too long. They knew, after we had researched the National United Church history, that the United Church of Canada was the first church in the world to issue a statement on global warming in 1988. And in 1989, we started having various policy statements about the impact of global warming, and we had documented all that in the backgrounder to our motions going forward. So the congregation was ready, and they knew that we had to act before we took anything on further. It worked because it was rooted in the congregation, and a lot of educational sessions were taking place all through this time in our congregation. The thing I haven't mentioned, and we'll only talk about perhaps in the discussion period, is that we got called on almost immediately for help from everywhere. And the morning after we had made our decision in Trinity St. Paul's, we had had our own press strategy around that too, because Greg Powell had come from the Pembina Institute, now from Greenpeace. We knew how to do press releases. So we had sent out press releases, and Dr. Lucy Cummings of the Faith in the Common Good, some of you may know her, sent us an email the day after our congregation made its decision saying, "Congratulations, you're the first faith community in Canada to take this stand." And at that point, we all looked at each other and kind of gasped, because we did not know that, and it carried with it a huge responsibility. And we then started setting up teams of us that we called our Traveling Roadshow. And we went around and helped do education with others. So we were regularly communicating with our church board and our trustees, and in fact, we had on our climate justice group 2 trustees, and we were joined by another trustee who got so interested in the whole process that she joined us. So we also had people among us who had an established history of work on divestment, and you've heard about Walter and my work there. We had Jim Kirkwood, whom a number of you know from his work on anti-apartheid work in the 80s. So what was the congregation seeing? I don't know whether you realize, but our building is host to the Tafa Music Orchestra and the Toronto Consort. And in 2012 and 13, we were working with them on a major renovation of our sanctuary to make it a better performance space for their orchestra that had become a world-renowned orchestra. So the whole sanctuary was torn apart. There were high feelings about this, and losing the pews on the main floor, and people were distraught. But this kept us focused on how we were acting as a congregation out in the world. So they all were seeing that we were getting a lot of publicity, and the Green Faith website in the United States was also watching what we were doing, and we had divested our funds, and we now had an improved financial trust position as a result of our divestment. Had been reported a year later to us that this had been good. So some of the outcomes of our work I've already mentioned. One of them was that we helped launch Fossil Fuel Faith Network across the country. I don't know how many of you are signed up for that, but there is just constant information being posted there for the reading and discussion of the members who are involved in that. It's a multi-faith network. And then we were participating in climate marches. We had 7 of our people go to New York in the fall of 2014 for the huge big climate march in New York. And then we went to Quebec City in 2015. Some of our members, I think 7 of us went up there. And then in Toronto, there were probably 20 of us here who were doing that. We were seeing a growing congregational pride in this. People were starting to talk about this, that they were so proud that we were doing this. And we were seeing the outcome of our work was making these meaningful connections with other churches. The thing that was most gratifying when we look back on it is how we shared the leadership of this group. There was no one leader. And every week, Greg tried to put that on our agenda. Who's going to be the leader? And that's the one agenda point we never went near. Nobody wanted to be the leader because everybody was busy. But what started emerging is people just volunteered to do different parts of the work. And we developed an enormous trust in each other so that we could mix up these groups that got sent here, there, and everywhere, and they would come back and train us. And that was great. We also, I say intergenerational organizing. That means that we were surprised when the first call was put out for people to join this climate justice group. We ended up with people representing 7 decades, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then one of our members went into her 90s while we were working. And so it was a very meaningful kind of experience for us. So that's just a quick look at our story, and I'll hand it over to Walter.